Good morning. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. John Faithful Hamer. Today, I'm going to be talking with Stephen Marche, the author. You've done all sorts of things. A novelist. Read articles that have been in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, Esquire, Walrus, all over the place. So much to talk about. But good morning, Stephen.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. Very well. Good. So I'm still sort of reeling from the Stormy Daniels interview last night.
Reeling from it?
Really well. It's just kind of it's so bizarre. It's a very strange world we're living in right now. So what do you make of all this?
Well, I mean, nothing came out that I didn't know about already. I mean, somebody mentioned that the most interesting thing about the whole interview was how Anderson Cooper treated her job like just a job. That was actually, to me, that was actually the most interesting thing. Like all the other stuff that we've all seen before, like we all knew that he's of course the kind of man who like brings a hooker to his room and asks her to spank, and then she spanks him with a magazine with the cover on. I'm like, that's not surprising, right? And none of the other stuff really, really upset me. I mean, I will say this is like the perfect. Trump is now completely safe from this story. Like the scandal has been completely removed from it.
Yeah.
It won't have any consequences.
The condom thing is weird, though. That's this common denominator in this story is that he doesn't ever use protection. I mean, like.
Well, he's a narcissist with no impulse control. So that doesn't really come as a surprise. Although, he's famously a germaphobe too. So,
yeah.
You would think that he would you would think anyone in their right mind would use protection when sleeping with a porn star. But,
yeah.
Or just with another human being even. Like but nothing of course is shocking. Although, can we really be shocked that much anymore?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, there was an article that Ben Shapiro came out with a little while ago where he said that essentially none of these scandals were going to affect his popularity because everybody who voted for him knew what they were getting into, and this is sort of part of his brand. Nobody really, really cares.
I think it's more like a change in the nature of politics in that scandal, avoiding scandal used to be the number one job of a politician. But I think what we're seeing and what we've seen over the past 5 years is that the power of celebrity is greater than all other powers. And because of that, scandal actually is a benefit. Especially a scandal like this, which is so human. It's not hard to imagine. You're like anyone can imagine just wanting to sleep with somebody you shouldn't want to sleep with, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think scandal at all will hurt Trump ever in any way.
Well, it's interesting because thinking about Doug Ford, I just read that piece that you wrote on Doug Ford. I mean, do you see a connection between the two phenomena?
Well, I definitely think Rob Ford was sort of the prophet he was the John the Baptist of Donald Trump. There was a week in Toronto where it was.
I'm quoting you on that totally.
Well, I think I've actually written that. I think I've already written that. But he was caught smoking crack and his popularity went up.
Yeah.
And that was the moment where it was
he's so down to earth,
Right. What is going on? Like, why would people want that? But, it was the evidence that the alienation was really deeper than any sense of, that politics was just reality television rather than, hiring civil servants to do a job.
Mm-hmm.
And the conservatives have certainly figured that out much sooner than people on the left.
Do you think there could be something? I mean, just spitballing here, but I remember talking with one of my Russian students, fairly recent immigrant to Canada, and she said, in an environment where they've got dirt on everybody. Mm-hmm. And even if they don't have dirt on you, they have the capacity to make up dirt on you. in an environment like that, she said, only the shameless are free.
Right.
And
exactly.
so if you're completely shameless, if you're just like, fuck it, I don't even care, then you actually have a kind of freedom there. So she said, when talking about the whole Trump phenomenon, and this was when Rob Ford was still around, and she said, well, no, I think what's going on there is that in this environment where there's so much dirt on everybody and it's so easy to get at dirt on everybody, the logical way for somebody to respond to this, whether it be a writer like you or whether it be a politician, is just be completely scandal proof. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's even more complicated than that. I mean, one thing I think is like the people who can be conscious about that. That's not really what's going on. Like neither Rob Ford or Donald Trump are strategic. They're just inherently shameless, right? Like they just don't give a fuck. And am I allowed to swear on your show?
Sure, it's fine.
So like like they just don't care. So it's not cynical, right? Like it's not like you couldn't identify it as a conscious strategy. But I think what's happening is actually that it's not just that scandal doesn't matter, it's that it's actually a benefit, right? Yeah. Like it's actually because we're in a situation where the people who win at politics are the people who dominate the attention cycles of social media. The question is really not what kind of attention you're getting, but the question is how much attention you're getting. I mean, this is something that Putin actually understood really early on. Like when you look at the writings of like Russian media scholars from the late 90s and the early aughts, like, Putin never resisted people making fun of him or putting like people would get weird posters. Like there were posters of him doing weird things. Like, there's the strongman stuff, which we all see as like totally ridiculous. How could that pass? But the comic part of it was actually part of the strategy. Right,
like him petting a dinosaur and stuff like that.
Him petting a dinosaur, or like there's also like a very popular one is him making a pot and looking like he can't make a pot at a potting wheel, and he's wearing a scarf at the same time, and there were also like comic memes, internet memes about Putin, but it didn't matter because like as long as he's the symbol, as long as he has that symbolic register, then it doesn't really matter whether it's negative or positive, and that's why it's actually different than traditional authoritarianism, which insists on like everything must be positive about the leader. It's actually, as long as the attention is on the leader, then everything else doesn't matter.
Oh, wow. So it's not so much controlling the narrative; it's controlling the theme,
exactly,
or the focus.
It's controlling the narrative it's controlling the narrative by simply evacuating all other possibility of stories, right? Like as long you just flood public consciousness with your image, and you win. Right, and and it doesn't really matter whether the image is good or bad. Like that, I mean, that's the thing about Trump. He just like he's there constantly. He's there constantly, and that constantness is actually what drives him. And Justin Trudeau is not really doing a different thing. He's doing exactly the same thing, and that's why I think people misunderstood that India trip. Like it doesn't actually matter that he comes off as ridiculous. It's good that he comes off as ridiculous because as long as he dominates social media, all other questions are really negligible.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think we're facing now.
And even then, in the way that he looks ridiculous, you can totally see that. Well, he's got his heart in the right place. It was
He's
just
humbling
like
himself
it was a
before
dumb,
the 905. And if you think people in the 905 aren't going to remember that he desperately wanted their attention, they will remember.
Yeah.
But the point really is not. It doesn't need to be that conscious. Like it just needs to be. It just is. That's why he's the first. Canadian prime ministers up until Trudeau got elected and then disappeared from our lives. Right. They would disappear for 3 or 4 months at a time. You wouldn't hear a single. He is constantly there because he knows that that's his job, essentially.
That's interesting. Rob Ford and Justin Trudeau are the two most recognized Canadian names in politics in the world.
I remember when Rob Ford. I mean, when I was writing a lot of op-eds, when Rob Ford came into power, it was like turning on the money spigot. I mean, there was no thing like people from Germany, like the editors of New York Times and Esquire said. I mean, the editors of Esquire said to me, if you want to write multiple times a day on this guy, we will buy it all. Like and the New York Times wanted everything, like as much as they could get. And people were writing from like newspapers were writing from Germany saying we will buy anything you have to write about Germany, and we'll translate it into German, right? And I mean, a friend of mine at the time was in Burkina Faso, not an outward-looking country, like not a cosmopolitan country, and he was like, "Oh, I'm from Canada," and they were like, Rob, country of Rob Ford." Right? I mean, so it's like, yeah, like that's the power of that is just nothing else in politics comes anywhere close to it. To it.
Today is recently the paperback version of The Unmade Bed came out, and I know that maybe if you could talk a little bit, I know you've written quite a bit on celebrity, a number of large, long essays on the subject, but if I remember correctly, you're working on a future book project on celebrity. Right?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Well, it's in very early stages right now, but I do think it is this force that, you know, no one talks like it. The people who talk about celebrity are people who are in the business of manufacturing celebrity or are, you know, monetizing celebrity, which is unbelievably easy to do. But, you know, if you go to a Washington Post political columnist or any random columnist, they do not know anything about celebrity, and they don't think about it. They think of it strictly as something for idiot children, whereas they deal with serious business of policy and, you know, party negotiations. Yeah. And like, as we've seen, like all of that stuff is irrelevant. Celebrity is just annihilating it all. And so like we are woefully unprepared for not only the present, but like the future of how dominant this force is, because no one, you know, the attempts to deal with it on a really serious basis are usually very short, and they're also usually only about you know, our little moment of celebrity, which for us people of our generation is like Madonna, right? And like Madonna in politics or whatever. That's actually not what's really interesting about this. So like what's interesting about this is that this works everywhere, and that it's been pretty constant for 200 years. The power of celebrity to just take all other value and crush it beneath its feet. So yeah, I mean, I really think it's the least understood force in our world. That's also kind of the most powerful, because we really won't take it seriously.
Yeah, I remember there was an article, I think it was in Esquire, it was on Megan Fox, is that correct?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember thinking it was an absolutely brilliant article.
Well, you would have been one of about three people.
I know, but it just was so clear to me that from the reception you got, especially from that stupid piece in Vice, that it was like casting your pearls before the swine, you know, like
somebody wrote about it just last week.
Highbrow people thought, why are you paying so much attention to this bullshit? And then sort of the Vice people are like, oh, you're so pretentious talking about this. And, you know, and actually like what the piece was doing, what I thought was really fascinating, and I passed it around to a couple people who study religion, and they really liked it. It was looking at it as a religious phenomenon, basically. Yeah. That this is the person who's almost like a sacrificial lamb, you know, of our celebrity culture. And there's a wonderful poem by the American poet Tony Hoagland called "Poor Britney Spears," right. And it's the only other sort of attempt to make sense of celebrity that I've seen that is similar to what you did with that Megan Fox piece. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about the reception, show you got after that?
Somebody wrote about it last week. Like, it's regularly cited as like the worst celebrity profile of all time. I mean, like that definitely happens. Although I will say also, oddly, like I do get calls from like journalism schools about it, because they want to talk to me about it and what happened with it. You know, like I mean, there are a couple of things that are going on. Like, first of all, I found her very fascinating woman, because she seemed totally aware of the emptiness of her own
that totally comes through.
of
That
her own
totally comes
reality,
through.
and she was making a very principled, intellectual, and moral attempt to deal with that, which seemed to me entirely admirable. I mean, I really like, she, I think people were really offended by my descriptions of her as this beautiful object, right? And my attempts to, like, I guess we're not supposed to, but like, to me, it was like, it would be like going and interviewing LeBron James and not talking about his ability to play basketball, right?
Yeah.
Like, the reason that we're talking about Megan Fox, like, she is not a great actress. She's a very interesting person, but like Helen Mirren, she isn't. Like, she is there because she has a genetic, like, an unbelievable, and it's not even the kind of thing that you can see when you meet her. You can only really see it in the camera. When a camera takes a picture of her face, the unbelievable symmetry of it. You can blow up her face to 50. I've seen her face blown up in some campaigns like 50 feet high, and it's still perfect. It's still perfectly symmetrical.
Your praise of her beauty was almost sort of Kantian. Like, it didn't seem to have any kind of.
That's how it seemed to me. I mean,
it
like,
had no like kind of lustfulness to it at all.
Well, exactly. That's how I felt.
Which is, I think,
about her.
part of the reason why Vice was like, "Fuck off." You're just.
Well, I mean, when you're insulted by Vice about your politics, like, I mean, like, you guys run articles
you're doing
on,
the
like,
right thing.
Russian whore's guide to anal. Like, this is, we all know what you sell. Like, Vice is sold like what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a bunch of young women to get high on drugs and then underpay them, and then we'll all get them to sign non-disclosure agreements. Like, we all know what Vice is, and and they're like, so honestly, being attacked by Vice, it's like, whatever. I mean, I really many better people have said nastier things about me. So it really, but also, like, if you're going to be a writer alive today, you really have to take death threats and everything else that goes with it in hand. So, like, you just that's just part of the job. And so you like, it really doesn't worry me much. But I do think that is one of the better pieces that I've written.
I love it.
And like, it got crucified. But on the other hand, like, at that same month, Esquire sent me there, and like, they knew what they were doing when they sent me. Like, they could have sent any number of 30 writers to write the standard celebrity fluff piece. Which is, like, to me, that's what's really scandalous. Is like when you send someone to talk to Jennifer,
Barack Obama or something,
and they just talk about, like, what a wonderful home she has, right? I mean, like, I did think the fact that Megan Fox was having a tattoo of Marilyn Monroe removed from her arm, in an attempt, and she was going to church, and she was trying, and she wouldn't tell me what church it was because she didn't want, she didn't want to talk about that stuff, like. I definitely thought it was all very interesting. And like, I do think it was, sometimes these feeding frenzies happen on the internet, and you just have to walk away from them because they don't really matter, right? Like, nothing ever comes to them. Certainly my career was not damaged by the fact that Vice magazine said I was the worst profile writer of all time. Right? Like, like, no editor has ever said, like, oh, we can't get him. We can't get him.
Well, I think it fits very much with the Vice ethos, and so you basically, by taking something seriously, anything seriously. I mean, what they hate sort of desperately is people who care about shit.
Yeah.
Any shit, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so they just want to make fun of anybody. Who likes stuff. I mean,
and that's why some of them
I came of age in Montreal when
right?
when Vice was founded in Montreal. That's when I was like, in my like late teens and early 20s. I hung out with a lot of those guys, right? So I know exactly what they were like. They came out of this whole sort of punk culture where it's supposed to, like, making fun of the hippies and who want to change the world, and making fun of basically anybody who cares about stuff, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, they were all running a fucking ad firm. I mean, that's what I loved about these guys. It's like, yeah, you know, we're gonna be punk. We're gonna be punk, but actually, we're gonna run an ad firm. I mean, you know, ultimately, their magazine like has produced nothing of value. Like, there's not a single good article that ever came out of Vice. So, like, you know, there's not a single good writer really came out of Vice. So, like, you know, ultimately the proof is in the pudding. And, you know, they were so fucking transparent even then. They were so fucking, you know, like, and they were exactly the kind of, like, we call ourselves feminists, but hey, any woman who works for us better sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's exactly the kind of, like, fraud of our generation that, like, I just couldn't have more contempt for it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So you said, like, this journalism department read that Megan Fox piece. Why?
Well, they're like, you know, it's you know, many people consider it a model of what not to do. Well, it's interesting. Like, you know, like first of all, like the model of what to do now for a celebrity profile is 100% to give the point of view that they themselves are trying to present, and that's a function of a lot of realities. It's not really cynical. It's not really PR. But like what you're trying to do is really give the thrust of the personality that the person is projecting, which is the
you give us a cover and we'll amplify your brand.
Well, that it's not as cynical as that. It's the same thing that's happened with music criticism, where being critical of an artist is just a huge argy-bargy. So instead, you try and create a critical voice by what you love, right? By saying what you love about things, and that creates poptimism, right? That creates you know, Beyonce is Bach kind of writing, and not that I don't love Beyonce, because I do, but like the same. That's the way that celebrity profiles now work. You know, I mean, just with the rare exception of something like where somebody's really blowing up, and like the Miles Teller profile by Anna Peel at Esquire, which was really a really great model to me, where you just have some asshole blowing up right in front of your eyes, and she just captures every last glint of the explosion. But you know, I think that's the only. I've written maybe 2 other celebrity profiles.
Oh, there was the one in the LA Times, if I remember correctly. There was.
What did I do?
There's another big one on celebrity politics.
Oh yeah, but I mean actual profiles of celebrities. I mean,
right.
I don't think I did more. I did Judd Apatow.
I can't remember any other. You've written so many, like,
and I wrote a couple.
I think 100 articles, or
100.
You've written a lot.
I've written 100 articles a year, my friend. Like,
are you serious?
Probably. I'm sure I had a year where I wrote 100 pieces.
Wow.
I mean,
so how do you decide sort of what? Because it seems to me usually you have people who write books.
Yeah.
Right. They sit down and they write a big project. Or they write little quick op-eds where they basically, it seems like they're following their Twitter, you know, feed in an ADHD fashion, and then they just like pop out like some anger, you know, op-ed piece.
Yeah.
But you do things of many, many different lengths. So what is, how do you manage that? Like,
well, basically, I mean, it sounds so crass, but there's like, there are 3 things that I think. One, I think about, can I write a real... First of all, there are things where it's like, I just have to write this. And that comes of all... Like, sometimes that'll be an opinion piece. Like, you know, Doug Ford gets chosen for PC. Like, basically, it's like pouring electricity into my blood. And until I write it, I'm going to be mad. So I have to write it in order to get it out. So that's a huge chunk of stuff. Like there's a lot of fiction that, you know, it doesn't make any sense for me to write short stories. Like the market for short stories is minuscule, and it's very hard to write short stories. Like writing a short story takes 6 months to a year to do, and then you publish it in even if you get the best possible place to publish it, it's read by like 500 people. You know, 300 of whom hate it because they're also writing short stories. But it does happen, like where it's like, you know, I have an idea and it's like I have to do this. Even though it
Is that what The Hunger of the Wolf was about?
well, The Hunger of the Wolf was a novel, so a novel's a bit different. Like a novel is like going to war. Like you can't you only do it under the most where you really like just like war. It's like we have no choice. We must.
Yeah.
There is you would only write a novel unless you're there. Everything was perfectly aligned because it takes a huge amount of time. It's hugely risky. There's absolutely no guarantee that it'll see the light of day. People almost nobody reads novels anymore, right? So like
my friends do.
Well,
my friends read a lot of them.
You're a professor in Montreal, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like thank God, but like it's I assure you that like that Doug Ford piece that I wrote for the New York Times got read by more people than every piece of fiction I've ever written combined, right? And also I genuinely think the essay is at a hugely exciting place right now, and
I totally agree.
And like it is creatively as well as commercially much more viable. So I guess the thing is like there's things I have to write, and then there's things that and more I just do those. If I were smart, I would just do those. That's all I would do.
But the Hunger of the Wolf.
Sometimes I need to make money,
yeah.
But really, actually, I don't really need to make that much money. So it's because I'm not particularly needy about those things. But it's, more and more, it's just like I have to do this, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Well, the Hunger of the Wolf, did that just sort of come to you in a dream, and what? Because it seems
literally
very much
high.
It seems like one big like vision that came to you in a dream, and then you just took like a year or two and spelled it out.
I was literally high, watching a hockey game, and the whole thing came to me in 3 minutes.
Yeah,
every plot.
Honestly, Stephen, I'm not joking at all. Like when I read it, I've read it twice now. When I read it the first time, the first thing I thought is this hangs together so perfectly that this must have been just like a flash. Like the whole thing just came to him, and then he kind of figured out how to articulate.
It was like the thing that was interesting about it was that literally every plot detail came within 3 minutes, and then it was a huge slog to get it down on paper because there was no other information. Like there was no other. I was simply putting down what I had gotten in 3 minutes, and that took me like a year and a half. So it was like this. It was like it was a real grind to get it down. But yeah, it was exactly like that. It was just like a dream, just like a dream.
And there is, in a way, it's kind of a skeleton key to all of your other writing, because you could see the issue of celebrity, you could see the issue of like sort of the corrupting influences of various kinds of power. There's obviously the character who's a writer trying to make it in New York City. Right? There's all these sort of autobiographical and elements of your essays can be seen in that novel.
Well, I did think more and more the fiction that interests me, the poetry that interests me too, is essayistic. And that may be a tip-off, right? Like the tip-off may be here, like, well, if what you like in things is the parts where they're essayistic, like maybe you should write essays, right?
Yeah. Well, you also could write aphorisms, by the way, because The Hunger of the Wolf is filled with, and also The Unmade Bed, it's filled with one-liners that could just jump off the page.
See, I don't think I could
be there by themselves.
No, there's that line of Wittgenstein, like, the raisins are the best part of a cake, but a raisin cake is better than a bag of raisins. Speaking of aphorisms, but like to me, I try to cut all the aphorisms when I'm writing. Like I try to cut all the good lines. That's just good practice. So that when they survive, it's like they have to be there. I don't think I could ever write aphorisms. Although I like that those aphorisms you've been sharing on Facebook lately.
Yeah,
they're pretty good.
No, I know what you mean though. There's Oscar Wilde in Picture of Dorian Gray. One of the things that I've always found really annoying about that novel is that very often it seems like one or two pages of prose are just there to set up the guy so he can say the good one
Right.
liner. And it feels very contrived. So I know exactly what you're talking about, like where you just it's like, oh come on, you're like I know I can see what you're doing there, and it's fucking annoying.
Well, I mean, the thing that's so interesting about Wilde is that his one-liners have kind of obscured his work. I
Yeah.
mean,
They outshine the story.
he is
very
really a
often, yeah.
case of like the triumph of celebrity, because it's like, oh, he's I have nothing to declare about my genius, or Niagara Falls, this is a woman's second disappointment after marriage. These are all great, but like they're all great, these lines, but like his fairy tales are unbelievable. I mean, they're like, and the stuff from the Yellow Book, gorgeous, right? And and of course he went to jail because he wouldn't listen to his lawyers and insisted on being witty in court, right? And so like there is a real way where like his witty celebrity distracted from his work. Portrait of Dorian Gray, I mean, that's amazing too. And I mean, needless to say, Importance of Being Earnest, like greatest comic play since Shakespeare for sure. So like, he's a real case of where the line actually distracts from the work, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's almost like a comedian that can't sort of resist the cheap jokes all the time, and it kind of takes away from the possibility of something better. But another thing I wanted to talk to you about is the whole issue with Cambridge Analytica and everything that's coming out, and manipulation of elections.
Yes.
And I mean, you've written on this, and you've said you have a theory about why the United States is perhaps more susceptible to social media manipulation than other places. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting about the Cambridge Analytica moment. I think America is much more susceptible to actually to political failures of all kinds, which I think I don't really know yet, but it's worth thinking about, like why. And these things seem to me all related, like the failure in Iraq and the failure to, like, this fundamentalist individualism makes social projects inherently unstable, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. But, like, when Germany started to feel the weight of Russian influence and meddling in its election, like, what happened was the political class, including the nationalists, like including the German far right, who had a lot to gain, refused it. And America, and American politics in particular, can't really refuse that stuff. I've had this, I don't want to sound vain, like this does sound very vain, but like I wrote "Is Facebook Making Us Lonely" on the cover of The Atlantic, like 6 years ago.
A long
6
time
years
ago.
ago.
That piece,
and at that time, like, I had to eat a lot of shit from tech journalists, and like where there was this constant, I'm the Luddite and a technophobe.
You're a Luddite.
But at the same time, like,
that,
there were a lot of people there saying like the real problem with Facebook isn't that it makes us lonely, but that it has all these privacy issues that are going to come and bite us in the ass and will eventually affect our politics. Lots of people were saying that. I got into fights with people who were saying, oh no, I think it's more this distraction, it's this incipient narcissism that's causing it and the depression that comes with it, rather than this stuff. And like, the thing that's so like, at what point is it like this is your fault? Like, you have to take responsibility for this as people, rather than blaming private companies. Like, like Facebook's done these apologies and so on, and it's desperate to apologize because by apologizing, it says we have this under control. But the simple truth is, like, it's not actually their job to control it. It's the job of government to control it, and it's the job of individuals to use this stuff responsibly. But, those two things seem so impossible that instead we just go around blaming Facebook for things. And it just seems silly to me. It just seems silly to me. It's like, and I think the word tech actually it's this great camouflage word, where it's like We call it tech rather than calling it what it is, which is business. That's all it is.
Yeah.
It's just business. But Google is tech. It's not. Google is the world's largest advertising company ever. Right? Because if Google were the world's largest advertising company ever, we'd just break it into smithereens, like we did with oil.
Yeah. Well, I think actually they don't. A lot of what the apology is about is just a very good PR strategy, because what they don't want is they don't want government to actually start regulating it. Right? I mean, all other kinds of communications, whether it be television, whether it print, there's all sorts of rules governing what you can and cannot do and all that stuff. The social media has thus far been in the United States very, very unregulated.
Yes.
Right. So they don't want government to move in and do something about that. Right now, that's I don't know if you've checked out the new book by Neil Ferguson, The Square and the Tower. It's fantastic. Just finished reading it last week. But in The Square and the Tower, he makes this argument that the real kind of comparison in our time is to the 16th century. And he says, so in the same way that you would have no Luther without the printing press, you would have no Trump without Facebook, right? And he explains, why this is the case and how it's. So, I mean, what do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, to me, it's more. I don't know. The 16th century. Unfortunately, I actually have a PhD in in Renaissance studies, so I actually know.
Yeah.
And the thing is that when the printing press came in, it was immediately regulated to within an inch of its life, and that's why you and the remnants of that are still in. That's why you need to have a date. And you need to have a copyright in the front of the book, because originally it was only very specific. The whole idea that print spread this chaos of information is not actually that accurate. I mean, what happened was that certain institutions were able to disseminate their information much more fluidly. So, I mean, it is true that there would be no Luther without the printing press, just as there would be no Donald Trump without Facebook. But on the other hand, Donald Trump is not Luther. I mean, to me, it's.
Oh, no, I know. It's just the point that Ferguson is making is that we often, especially in historically predominantly Protestant countries, we have this idea that the printing press was this great force for liberation. And,
oh God, no.
Bringing good. And the point that he makes is that, well, actually, it just amplified ideas better, and good ideas and bad ideas. So he says, we often forget that the really big witchcraft craze happened because of the printing press. Right? So all sorts of crazy fake newsy ideas spread really rapidly as well. Right? Well, and he says that's the parallel to what's happening now.
Yeah, although, I mean, as you mentioned, I think on Twitter or Facebook the other day, the thing about fake news that's more increasingly become evident is that it's people who know it's fake spreading it, right?
Yeah.
And
well, that was actually just an epiphany that I had just the other day, because
Pew Research had a thing that said that it's true. They have data on that. Right?
Yeah.
They have data on that. That people are.
Yeah, but I saw it personally, because there was the number that was going out saying that there were 18 mass school shootings since January 1st, and I had heard this from repeated in dinner parties, in social media land. I had heard this repeated, and I repeated it in a debate I was having with a gun nut, like an NRA guy. And I had my ass handed to me, and he demonstrated very clearly that was not true. And so then I went, because I hate that shit, right? So I went and contacted a couple of the people who had shared this, and I said, did you know that this was false? And the response I got from a few people was, well, yeah, we knew it was kind of an exaggeration, but we got to do something. And I thought, oh my God. And these are these are people with PhDs. These are in one case, a professor, at an Ivy League institution. I thought, this is insane. You're acting like fake news is spreading because of these, illiterate, toothless people living somewhere, right? No, it's actually being spread by people who really ought to know better.
It's suicide of intellectualism, I guess. Not that's a very clumsy phrase for it, but it's like it's anti-intellectualism of intellectuals, right? And it's contempt for the terms of debate by people who who shape that debate, and it's poison. I mean, it is the poison that is leaking into everything. And I mean, you could call it the term I talked to a guy the other day who called it effective partisanship, which is that, essentially it's not really partisanship. It's like actual emotional loathing for the other side. But so that my point is really that's very different than, the spread of information by print where people really believed what they were saying. Like they really, like Tyndale was willing to burn to death to publish the Bible in the translation that he believed in. And
my father is named after him, by the way. My father's name is Tyndale.
Right. Yeah. Like, so these are like, that's heroism, right? I mean, insanity at some points as well, but also, there was a pursuit of the truth there rather than the pursuit of, really what boils down to, I think, an aesthetic. Like you're pursuing an aesthetic that everything is consumed by, and you get these tribal epistemologies too. Like, and it's just getting worse and worse. It's just getting worse and worse. Like it's there's no sign of it abating whatsoever, even though people are conscious of it.
Do you think there's a way to get out of it?
I mean, like,
this is so typical Stephen Marche. Everything's getting worse. It's not going to get better.
I think
tragic vision.
Well, like when you like, I think it's partly because I've been spending like a month talking to people who, for a piece that I'm working on about like how close America actually is to civil war, like what would constitute the transition into civil war and what that looks like. And, the answer that they give when I say, well, what gets us out of, because there are a lot of spirals. Like, things are spiraling out of control in a lot of ways. And the answer that they always give is like, oh, a catastrophe. That's what usually happens, right? Like what usually happens is if you want political unity, like there's a war, or there's a huge natural disaster, or what happened in Chile where there's a coup and a huge chunk of your population is tortured to death, and then you wake up from this dream of loathing and realize that there are people who you need to start thinking about people in a broader sense than like your friends and enemies. But yeah, those are the ways these things tend to end. Not with like rational fight. I mean, I feel like my job is to fight this as hard as I can with as much nuance as I can bring to things, and with as much attention to actual data and attention to reality as I possibly can. But like, look at the unmade bed. Like, the unmade bed is like, let's look at the reality of this. Let's look at what's actually happening rather than being on team man or team woman. But any outrage piece,
which just ensured that everybody was going to hate it.
Any piece that just says, can you believe how terrible shit is? God, these men are fucking awful. Or will women just shut up? And like, that's the stuff that grabs attention. Like, it's just so, that's just kind of the way of the world. I mean, and it's ugly.
Yeah. No, it's, do you watch the show Homeland at all?
I stopped after a couple seasons.
Yeah, it got really bad, and I
hear it's getting good again, right? That's the
oh my god,
that's the word. Yeah,
unbelievable. It's the season right now is the best season of all, and it's really gotten good. But they're specifically dealing with the whole sort of Civil War theme,
right? And
they have this character that is just so obviously a thinly veiled Alex Jones, and he is the actor even sort of puts on the we're gonna have civil war
Right.
and but the guy is actually just a celebrity, whore. He basically just wants and you find out later on that he doesn't even really believe a lot of the things he's saying. He pretends to be a gun nut, but you find out he's actually never even fired a gun actually does whip people up into such a frenzy that there are some big altercations. There's a shootout with the FBI, and then there's just these wonderful scenes where this guy, who's this right-wing shock jock, has to actually confront the fact that people have died because of his bullshit.
Right. I mean,
you saw Alex Jones?
Oh yeah, I saw him at the inauguration. I was at the inauguration.
Oh, wow. Oh right.
And they'd closed off one of the gates, protesters had closed off one of the gates. And he walked up to them and was screaming at them, and then sort of walked off. And the police were kind of between them, and the police looked like they didn't know what the fuck to do. And that was certainly, I wrote about that for Walrus. That's one of the pieces I'm most proud of, going to that inauguration and seeing it. But when you see it, it's like a civil war, but they don't really mean it. It's like a civil war, but they're not actually going to shoot anybody until they do shoot people. But they all have, it's essentially a civil war of lifestyles. And Americans have always been amazingly good at separating their politics from any consequence on other people, right? I mean, I think because they're so rich and huge, and they're so safe ultimately, they do that. But it's I mean, he's a. I talked to some of his supporters there, and the guy I talked to was like, "Oh, it's just performance art." I mean, he called it performance art in court, right?
Yeah.
And
he was in divorce court, right?
In divorce court, yeah.
Because his ex brought up that he's unstable clearly, and he said, "Oh, this is just performance art," and of course, people took that and said to all of his followers, "Hey, check it out,"
Yeah, I mean.
He's just joking.
He's just joking. I mean, the size of his operation it's enormous, right? I mean, I think it's up to 30 million uniques a month or something. I mean, massive amount.
Yeah, but of course, Alex Jones does exactly the same shit as Doug Ford, where you have these people who are incredibly successful. They have a lot of money, a lot of resources, a huge following, and yet they still act like they're the underdog, which drives me insane.
Well, I just love this thing. The Doug Ford.
You don't get to talk like the underdog when you're running an operation that has 30 million listeners. You don't get to talk like the underdog when you're a professor at Harvard. Shut the fuck up. You're not the underdog anymore.
I got a hate letter the other day about Doug Ford, and the guy was like, "You're
first of many."
Yeah, well, he was like, "You're a coward, and the usual stuff." I mean, there was nothing threatening in it, but it was just like, "You're a coward because you wrote in the New York Times. You should only write here. You're airing our dirty laundry," all this shit. And then he called himself, "We're going to be the government of the deplorables." This was like the sign off from this guy.
Wow.
And then I looked him up, and he was a professor of psychiatry, and he had the Order of Canada. And I'm like, you can't. God. I was like, you cannot have the Order of Canada and be a deplorable. How can you feel victimized in this world when your country has given you its greatest honor? But it is really, I mean, there's no other way to put it. It is white people feeling threatened by feeling their dominance to be threatened. I don't play a lot of identity politics games, but there's no question that is a huge part of it. There's just, it must be. Because why else would this guy feel that he's a victim? Sitting there with his Order of Canada, his massive house in downtown Toronto, his entirely massive career, but he somehow feels like he's the deplorable. It's just bizarre, right?
But it is also the rhetoric, as you pointed out in your Doug Ford piece. It's the rhetoric of populism, which has sort of permeated the left and the right, in different ways, where there's this anti-intellectualism and there's this sort of need to, the people who talk about, how bad identity politics is and we should stop this oppression Olympics are very often competing quite vociferously in the oppression Olympics.
Absolutely.
And so it's they're doing it themselves, and so everybody is trying to present themselves as the sort of the underdog and the beleaguered victim, and it's just from a purely aesthetic standpoint, it's one of the things that really gets under my skin. I think it's because my mother always taught us, good British mother. She always said, don't be a sore loser, don't be a sore winner, right?
But don't you? I mean,
she said it was just as important. Yeah,
like, my parents really taught me like be grateful, like like I don't know, like there's just this like the Doug Ford thing. I mean, it gets much more serious. Like, I tend to ignore. I don't think ideas matter very much in the future of the world. But like Doug Ford where he just read out the Sunshine List, like civil servants who make more than $100,000 a year, and it's like, when you were at City Hall, like the number of people on the Sunshine List spiked enormously. Everyone on your staff has been on the Sunshine List at one point because that's what it takes to run a modern city. It's unreal to imagine that you're going to have a decent bureaucratic class if you don't pay them. Like it's just this, and he knows that, right? Of course he knows that. It's just all this posturing, this weird game. And
it's also a kind of public shaming, I think. It's you're trying to sort of shame people, right? And say like, I'm going to put your name on. I mean, I find the whole idea of the Sunshine List perverse.
Totally perverse. So
like,
Canadian.
Why would you put people's like private information out there like that? Like,
also the number, which I think is like 100,000. Like, it's like, wow. What a huge sum of money to pay somebody for their work. Like, it's so 70s. Like, it's so 70s, right? It's like, oh, if he's making $100,000 a year, he must be in Florida all the time. You know what I mean? Like they're gonna keep this number, $100,000 a year, and then like it's gonna be like the people who run the sewage department. Like, it's just bizarre.
Apparently, and I think it's Sweden, but in Scandinavia, this is a fairly common thing, where they will publish I think it's like one day a year where everybody's income tax returns are available. So you can find out what all of your neighbors are making. So it's just this, and it's supposed to be, it's almost sort of Puritan in a way, like this holy watching, right? Like, we're going to observe you and make sure that you're not out of line and that you're trying to enforce a kind of sort of sameness, right, into everything. But
I mean, I don't have any the problem is not this the problem is like, what does this information mean? You know what I mean? Like, and we just don't, we're just losing the capacity to process information in any meaningful way. I mean, I heard someone, like one of the early pioneers of the internet, I forget who it was, but he was like, we originally thought that if we brought all the information of the world in one place, it would create this incredible kind of ability to compare things. And he said it would be like chords, like you'd be able to get a comparative religion like you'd never seen before. And instead he said it turned into this like long beep, like just right. And that's what it is now. It's like, it's like just a beep, just a long going on forever that has no signal to it.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Okay, before I forget, I have to ask you about the things that you said in the Unmade Bed, but also in your article after the whole Harvey Weinstein thing and talking about the MeToo movement and everything, and talking about confronting the sort of inherent brutality of the male libido. And I mean, you took a whole lot of hate on all sides for that one. So can you talk a little bit about what
I did get a whole lot of love for that one too, though.
Oh,
I
okay,
mean,
that's good.
I mean, I would say that would be one of the most popular things that I've written for sure. Like that was not a that was not a that was not a Megan Fox situation by any stretch of the imagination.
But I saw a bunch of like apologists, rape apologists.
Oh yeah, but like it's if you worry about like Tommy Lawrence or the like Fox News people are like Jessica Valenti. I mean, you just drive yourself crazy. Like there's no thinking going on there. So why would you care?
It's just a reflex.
It's just a reflex action. It's like you're gonna get that. It's exactly like a reflex action. Hit the knee, it goes up.
They seem like bots. They seem like bots. Like I know they're real people, but they behave in their reactions to current events. It's like if I can predict. I mean, one of the reasons why I like reading you is because I don't know what you're going to write about, and when you write about something, when I start reading your article, I don't know where it's going to go.
Well, this is the point of art. This is the point of like when you read Shakespeare, Hamlet at the beginning, you don't know what he's going to be like at the end, and anything that is so like the predictability of modern thinking is just shocking to me. Like, and it is the reason for it is that they know that if I've written a popular piece and Jessica Valenti writes, Stephen Marche is a misogynist she will get 20,000 Facebook likes, right?
Yeah.
And that can then be monetized and then she can get paid for it, right? That's the way this works. But that's why nuance is such a hunted animal, right? Like being like it is going towards extinction. But like, I mean, I would say like the response to my New York Times piece would be pretty emblematic of how poor our collective thinking is, right? I mean, like that is Freud 101, right? I mean, it is. I mean, is there anything more obvious to say than that the id is not rational and it is very difficult to get the id to a place where it is compatible with human justice and our notion of the value of the individuality of human people. I mean, childish. It like a thought so simple, it's so basic, it's almost embarrassing to say out loud. But when you say it out loud, the reaction is like that it is absolutely shocking to hear.
Yeah. Well, because you're not. We're supposed to be completely equal unless we're sort of conditioned to be otherwise, right?
Everything is supposed to be very easy.
That's the party line.
Everything is supposed to be very easy. Everything is supposed to be like, oh, it's just terrible. There's such an easy solution to this, right? And it's like actually being a human being is really, really complicated. Like it's not, it's not. Like it's not a business that lends itself to simple platitudes. Like it just isn't. And like I after I wrote that piece, I was like, I wonder what would happen if I gave them Foucault 101, right? like I wrote a piece where it was like, here's what Freud said. Like it is very complicated. How about if I said, Foucault 101, which is like, any attempt at improving morality is itself a power trip. I wonder how they react to that. I mean, would they be so shocked? I mean, well, you probably couldn't get it in print.
Yeah. I mean, are you by any chance, I've wondered this for a long time, are you inspired by Michel de Montaigne?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I wrote about him in my PhD quite a bit. I mean, yeah.
Okay, because I've
read it in many different translations.
Because your essay style is, I was trying to explain it to somebody, and I said your essay style is most similar to Michel de Montaigne's style in the sense that, I mean, for me, Montaigne is the gold standard when it comes to essay writing, and because
I would never
essays,
say
you don't know where they're gonna go.
Yeah. Well, I would say
like he'll have an essay.
That feature is the feature that I most admire in all art generally of all kinds, right? I mean, and the thing about Montaigne is that I think about anyway, is that he got all that stuff basically sitting on his ass in France, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
what's crazy about it. Is like,
Yeah.
you know, if you've ever seen what a Renaissance library looks like a few hundred books would be, you know, like I've been to the Medici library in Florence, which was the biggest library in the world at the time, and it was 800 books, right?
Wow.
So he didn't really have a huge amount of scholarship, and he was able to get all that stuff simply by asking himself what he really thought.
Well, he's also
What do I really think about
incredibly
this?
self-aware person. You know, very, very much.
All that
Yeah,
shit is
he's
amazing.
very sort of aware of his own feelings, his own thoughts, his own intentions. He's got to be like. I don't think it was any exaggeration when Nietzsche said that the world is a more beautiful place because this man lived and wrote essays. Like, just because of that.
I think the thing
right?
is that all the great essays have that. All the great essays have something. They start with one thought, and then they find out what they really think while the essay is being written. And you know, that's true of a lot of great writers. It's certainly true of John Donne. It's true, like, to me, the Renaissance, which is sort of my intellectual playground when I was a professor, like, that is the one thing that you are for sure see in every writer of that period is this willingness to go into uncertainty and doubt. But I also think it's like, you know, like Ian Brown at the Globe, that's why he's good. Because he starts with a belief, and then he allows himself to be talked out of it by himself, right? And that's also what you see in great essayists like, oh God, her name is escaping me. The one with the White Album and Joan Didion.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Like Joan Didion is, and you know the other one who I think is my great hero, which is Germaine Greer, where she really was willing to take the whole risk. Every time she went out, right? Like she was really willing to like throw away all of her friendships every time she wrote a book, which is incredible. It takes incredible moral strength, not just you know, intellectual ability.
Yeah.
Like, you know, just the willingness to be like, okay, so I'm a feminist icon. I'm going to write a book, and the conclusion that I come to is going to offend every one of my friends.
It's like,
right? Like
the New York philosopher Aaron Haspel. He has this wonderful line. It's so unbelievably true. He says, "No government has ever been able to police your words and thought more than your friends and family do." Right? Like, so your friends and neighbors. So the people closest to you are the people that it's most painful to disagree with, right? To have them sort of attacking you on Facebook and saying, "How dare you, you know, stray from the party line," right? That's way more painful than having your piece attacked by Vice, for instance, right?
That's true, but you know, everyone has always faced that. Like, anyone who comes to power anywhere has to ultimately choose between some external standard that they believe in and their network of friends, right? And like, one of the big differences about being like in a third world country or a developing country as opposed to a developed country is that in developing countries, people in power stick by their friends.
Yeah.
Which seems like a virtue, but it's actually, you know that line at the beginning of The Journalist and the Murderer, like any journalist who is worth their salt is knows that what they're doing is morally indefensible.
Yeah.
Because you're betraying people, right? You're getting people into their confidences, and then you're betraying them. Yeah. And the problem really is...
Yeah, we talked about this with regard to The Fire and the Fury. Remember when the Wolf book came out?
Right.
And we were talking about this. We're like, how could they have been so stupid? Like, this guy's you were saying, I think you said, like, this guy's a gossip columnist, and you told him everything. Like...
Well, trusting that guy, I mean, that's particularly insane.
Yeah.
Like, Michael Wolff is like, I mean, you know, there are lots of journalists out there who seem really great and are really honest, loyal people, and they convince their subjects that they'll be honest and loyal with them, and then the subject discovers at the end that actually they're loyal to their readers, which is who they're supposed to be loyal to.
Yeah.
I mean, my point is like actually betraying your friends is the great intellectual liberation. That's you have to, everyone comes to power in certain ways in their lives, whether it be like having a voice or whether it be actually controlling an institution. And like if you run those things to please your friends and your family, then all you have is your friends and family, right?
Yeah.
Like it's actually this betrayal that's the greatest value that you can bring.
Well, I think it's possible to take it too far. I mean, you look at somebody like John Adams, one of the founding fathers, one of the first sort of presidents and stuff like that. And people said about John Adams that he was so intensely trying to sort of prove how fair he was. Like he was the lawyer who defended the British soldiers after the shooting, right, and everything, like just crazy stuff. But this was just because he was so committed to being fair and to giving the other side a fair shake that he ended up being very, very harsh towards his friends, and unnecessarily harsh towards his friends, and unnecessarily kind towards his enemies, and that's how he ended up getting screwed a couple times. So I think it can be possible.
But that's Brutus. Brutus was the first Brutus, like not the Brutus who killed Julius Caesar, but the Brutus who was like 500 years earlier. He killed his own son when he was judge, when he was a consul of the city. And that's how that's how that name became synonymous with civic virtue.
Unbelievable.
Right.
Well, you see, that's the whole Abraham and Isaac story. And that's, for me, that's always been a fundamental question that I ask when I meet people. And when I sort of read people and stuff like that, I think to myself, would you have sacrificed your son, right, for your religion, for your politics? And what I mean that more sort of not exactly literally, but, are you the kind of person who would have ratted on your parents under Stalin, like, and would have like ratted your parents out to Stalin? Like,
right.
Are you the kind of person that would have hid Jews in your basement? Would you, are you willing to sacrifice real human beings for ideas, right? And one of the things that I think makes a place like a political culture like Canada and a political culture like what you've normally had in the United States is that you have this, very, very large majority of people who, as you said before, right, that, ideas don't matter that much. The vast majority of people are just, at the end of the day, not willing to sacrifice Isaac, right? And,
no.
And I think increasingly you have people that are, and that really creeps me out, right? On the left, on the right, they're willing to sacrifice real suffering people who need healthcare for their sort of libertarian ideal. They're willing to sacrifice, all sorts of people seem more and more ready to sacrifice the son for their God, however they define that God. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, there's a famous Camus line about terrorism in Algeria where he's like, if I could have my ideas or I can have my mother, I'll take my mother. Right? Like, he says somebody's mother's being blown up in these buses. Like, if it's between being right and that's what it was. The line was, if the choice is between being right and my mother being alive, I'll take my mother being alive.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I just think the nature of the distortion in America is actually very hard. I have a piece coming out about this in the LA Review Books very soon. Like, having traveled over America, right? Once Trump became elected, I basically suspended all other activities and just went to look at the things in America and to see what I could see. And the distortion is really on all levels. Like, I don't think it is absolutely this not caring about other human beings, but it's also the sense that that your own humanity is completely ignored, and these cycles of recognition and failure to recognition that just are building off each other in these incredibly crazy ways, and so it is leading to, it's, my point here is that it's not really dehumanization that we're driving towards. It's fantasy. You know,
Huh.
I think like when we compare ourselves, like it's natural when you're a historian, when you're intellectual person, to compare yourself to the past, to compare yourself to fascism, to compare yourself to, you know, the great distortions of the middle of this, and which certainly there are, you know, it's as serious as that. It's just, I think it's distinct. Like, I don't think a gun nut is not dehumanizing the victims of Parkland. It's that they have these ideas that lead them to think that they actually have a better way to help those people. Mm-hmm. And because there's no common ground of reliable information, and there's no common frame for debate, it just spirals out of control, and that leads the people at Parkland to feel dehumanized. Then they accuse the gun nuts of being insane. The gun nuts feel dehumanized, and then that's effective partisanship, and it just leads to this sundering of all ideas and all common ground. Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily like my ideas are more important than people. It's more like, why won't people treat me like a human being?
Yeah. I mean, just to loop back to something you said earlier, you've had this very interesting thesis for a couple of years now, that one of the reasons why we haven't had the kind of the ugly politics that we see happening in the United States is that the conservative, I remember you said this is actually because the Conservative Party has very, very consistently sort of kept these people out, right? They've had opportunities to go all Ezra Levant and rebel-y, and they've been like, they could have, it was low-hanging fruit. And they've said, you know what, we're just not going to go there. And I mean, is the Doug Ford thing changing your mind about that?
Definitely.
Okay, so
can you talk about that? Political choices matter. Doug Ford is absolutely all of that. He is absolutely the whole business of it, and the other thing is the whole of the progressive conservative movement just lined up behind him like that, without even thinking about it.
Yeah, so, I mean that's going to change, you know, your thesis quite a bit.
Definitely.
Yeah. So what happened? I mean, is it something special to Ontario? Because I mean, the Conservatives I know in Quebec, obviously they're not typical of Conservatives everywhere, but they're completely uninterested in the Ezra Levant bullshit. Like, they're just...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Ezra Levant is like the best thing that could have happened to the Liberal Party of Canada. I mean, they should send him a check every month. Because, I mean, people like me who are entering middle age, starting to see a few things differently, like, it would not be impossible for me to vote for a Conservative politician. Yeah. Like... Same here. Yeah. In Ontario, in the last election, I mean, Patrick Brown was not my favorite person, but I definitely was weighing options. Like, it was not, it was not like, oh, I'm so excited, but anyone who's ever had coffee with anyone at the Rebel, forget it. Forget it. Right? I mean, I may have conservative ideas, but you know what? I don't hate the gypsies.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like they're just some very, very, very clear lines for me, that are, you know, I don't know what happened. I mean, the one that I really find fascinating was Chris Alexander, and what happened to him. I actually don't think, and what he meant. I knew him when he came back from Afghanistan, and he was absolutely a very brilliant man. And when I met him, I was convinced he was absolutely the epitome of what we needed in Canadian politics. And very outward-looking man, spoke multiple languages. I went to his book launch. He wrote a very, very good book, and he gave his opening lecture in Pashtun.
Oh, wow.
Wonderful. His wife is this wonderful woman who runs this NGO for Afghan women and girls and crafts. She's incredible. Decent man. Like, there's no question that he was a very decent, humanistic, and just straight up brilliant. I mean, you know, he was ambassador to Afghanistan at 30, and he was hugely intelligent. And then, you know, in and then he's running Islamophobia hotlines out of some for reasons I don't really understand. And I wrote very angrily about that at the time in many places. I thought it was a disgrace. And why this fall? Why this decline?
It was so kind of East Germany, like creepy, creating this environment of suspicion and mistrust, and that was terrible.
Also, like we're in Canada. We have multiculturalism is a positive virtue. I mean, even if you're able to, for political expediency, to shave off a few votes of some alienated constituencies, like that's not a sustainable long-term play at all. I mean, even when the Parti Québécois tries it, it fails, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so why? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not nearly as sort of confident and optimistic as you are on that score. I think actually we're going to be living with this for a while, and I think it's something that we're going to have to just struggle against persistently, but I think it's going to have an appeal for quite some time to come. I mean, I see this right in Montreal. There was I'm wondering how much I can say about this on the air, but okay. I have friends that work in intelligence stuff, and then I also there was a scandal recently where a bunch of Cégep students, college students here in Montreal, were radicalized, right? And they this just completely was kind of freaking everybody out. They thought, well, what is going on? Why are they suddenly becoming? They were trying to get together and go to ISIS, join like the Islamic State in Syria and things like that. It was quite a few of them, and it was caught at the last minute because some friends or relatives, called up CSIS and said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do about this?" So as long as there's stuff like that happening, and as long as there's terrorist attacks happening on a fairly regular basis, I think there will be a political market for Islamophobia. Like, I don't think that's going to go anywhere. Because it's not. I mean, they're not like just. It's sort of like, okay, for me the historical analogy is if you go back to the fin siècle period, like around 1900, if you looked at that time, the vast political leaders all over the world were being assassinated by anarchists, right? There were bombs going off all over and it was almost all anarchists, right? So if you were freaked out about anarchism in the first decade, let's say, of the 20th century, that to say that you were being completely, I don't know, phobic in some irrational way, like, no, actually, like, most of the things blowing up and were actually all from this one group, right? So, I mean, the way that they responded to anarchism was completely insane, and to some extent were reproducing that mistake. I mean, they did things like, for instance, in Boston and New York, they demonized the entire Italian community,
right?
Because a lot of anarchists came from the Italian minorities in places like the United States. And in fact, what they did by demonizing whole communities and indiscriminately arresting people, it just made it far more likely that people were going to not report your cousin who's just got into anarchism because you don't trust the police, you don't trust the law enforcement. But I mean, but you think Islamophobia is just a passing fad?
No. I mean, well, I think the hatred for others is spiking in a intense way, and it's taken the form of Islamophobia in the particular form that we are. Although anti-Semitism is coming back in a big way.
Oh yeah,
But this is also true in India, right? It's also true. It's true in Britain. It's true all over Europe. It's true it's certainly in North America. The question for Canada is that we're we feel like still to this day, we're probably the last people on earth who actually believe in multiculturalism generally as a philosophy. No, I'm serious.
Yeah,
I mean, like,
I don't know. A lot of Australians still do. It seems to me.
Australia is recovering from setting up as they called it, the tropical gulag, where they, and they had they had pictures saying you will not make home here that were promoted by the government. I mean, because of Quebec, because there was a existential struggle over ethnic nationalism versus multiculturalism, with a winner. Like that's why people like me feel patriotic about multiculturalism, because the country wouldn't exist without it, right? There would be no Canada without it. There would be, a rump North America English people country and, Quebec, right? And so, like we I don't think we've thought through at all the difficulties of being multicultural. There's a really odd way where even in our educational system, and certainly in our cultural world, we regard multiculturalism as the natural way to live. Like, of course we'll all get along. This is the way. Of course, this is the way it's going to be. Everybody should get along. If you can't get along, there's something wrong with you. Well, I mean, go somewhere else in the world and have a look at what it looks like, right? Like, I just came back from Tokyo. Amazing.
Oh, right.
Amazing city, amazing country, makes Toronto look like, Halifax, like makes New York look like nothing, right? I mean, there's like 10 Fifth Avenues. I mean,
that's crazy.
Hugely developed. I mean, you can get some of the best Italian food I had in my life. I had there, you cannot adopt a child. If you adopt a child in Japan, that child does not necessarily get Japanese citizenship, right?
Wow.
Right, like it is if you've, like, the person who runs the biggest telecom company in the world is of Korean ancestry. Like, I think he's been there their family's been there 3 generations. He's not a Japanese citizen. That is strictly an ethnic definition of citizenship. And that's really common. That's like, even India, the ultimate pluralistic, nation of the achievement of that pluralistic dream, really at great, one of the great beacons to humanity, in its pluralism of the mid 20th century. Even it is crumbling very, very rapidly. And so, like, actually, I think we have to understand that multiculturalism is not inevitable at all. And that if we want to preserve it, and if we want to keep it as a way of life, which I firmly believe that we must do, we're going to have to think through it and work through it. And that might involve, it's not going to be like, as we keep coming back to in this conversation, like, the problem is that everyone thinks the answers to everything is simple. Just do this, do that. It's all very easy. Like, it's actually not easy at all. But that, it's hard to convince people to think, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you're sort of patriotic when it comes to multiculturalism, but you're really not patriotic when it comes to indigenous issues. I mean, like that piece that you wrote on it was one of the harshest things I've read on that subject. I mean,
I think they're related. I mean,
like, can you explain how they're related?
We have this fantasy, like, oh, there's lots of room here. Everyone can move here. We'll all get along. There's just a little more room. Everyone will be fine, right? And it's like, well, actually, no. Like, actually, if you want to deal with the reality, partly to me, the indigenous question is strictly about our fantasy of ourselves, right? Like, this fantasy of us as these virtuous good little servants of the British Empire. Like, Australia got the criminals, America got the warriors. We got, like, the priests and the preacher man's boys, right? And we still have that, like, we're going to be better than the best of the British Empire. And it's like, well, go ask we banned the Sundance, right? We banned the Sundance in Alberta. We banned the idea that we knew exactly what we were doing in British Columbia, for sure. I mean, just to take the most obvious example, like, the government knew what it was doing, and it was also warned many, many times, this is going to lead to you being unable to justify your own laws to your own people. And you know who warned us of that? Lord Dufferin. Lord Dufferin wrote, when he was Governor General, wrote a long thing to the Architects of Confederation who said, if you do not accept the title of these claims, you are not going to be able to justify your own title to the land. And so to me, like, it's not really about the virtual Olympiad or whatever, or victimization. It's actually about reality. Like acknowledging a reality that has not been acknowledged, and also a history that is super complex and super cruel.
Yeah. I don't know how we're going to handle that situation. I'm also, I don't know if you've read the Charles Mann's book 1491, where he talks about, and in 1493, the sequel, where he talks about what the Americas were like before Columbus showed up. And
right.
One of the things that has been haunting me since I read that book is he just talks about how like the numbers of people that were here, the number just keeps going up and up and up. So for instance, when I was in undergrad, the people who said that there were 25 million, 50 million people, they were considered wackos who were just making up numbers in order to inflate like their political position or something like that. Actually, it turns out the real numbers are way higher than that, probably. Right?
I just came back from Belize. So I was in Lamini, which is a Mayan city that was basically killed off in 1591. And, there were 70,000 people in that city. And it's huge. It is a huge city that goes on forever. Just covered in jungle and monkeys right now. It's incredibly powerful to see these things. Because this is where we're going too, right?
Towards but I mean, one of the things that he makes clear again and again is that the vast majority of the peoples of the Americas were killed by disease long before they ever met any Europeans, like long before. And that, it could be easily 95% of the population of the Americas were wiped out by disease. Now, the moral issue this sort of bothers me with is that, okay, take a random example. There's a corner store, a Dep, on the street that I live on, and the building burned down through no fault of the Dep owners. It was some crazy guy was lighting a fire or something. Anyway, and so the whole building burned down. It took a while for them to rebuild, but when they rebuilt, he had the right. It's sort of been on the books for a very long time, municipal law. He had the right that if they're going to put a store in that building, he gets the first chance to put his store there because his store was there first, right? So it seems to me that if a lot of the native peoples of the Americas, if they were wiped out through this sort of fire, this sort of disease bomb that was kind of nobody's intention because they didn't understand germs enough back then or at all to do it on purpose, then it makes our sort of right to this land much more sketchy. Because it's one thing if you fight a war with somebody, and I'm not saying it's pretty, but if you fight a war with somebody and you win, then it's like, all right, this is my land now because I won. But if somebody sort of just loses all that by some random accident, and while they're absent, you run in and like take it over and say, this is mine now, right? I don't know. The right to it is a little more, or a lot more sketchy.
That you're talking like cosmic philosophical realities. Like we made promises to indigenous people as a government that we completely failed to live up to. We made promises that we I'm not talking like vaguely. I'm talking in treaties.
Yeah.
Like that the queen signed, or her representative signed, and we also set up an educational system that I really do feel like, I know this word gets thrown around, but I do feel that cultural genocide is the only word to describe it. It was a conscious plan to annihilate, languages and religions. And we now know like what this does. It makes people rootless, and it makes life very hard to have meaning. And so, with the stuff you're talking about, maybe like 100 years from now, we'll start to think about that. What I would like is to actually, well, first of all, I'd like to stop building dumb hydroelectric dams that, really that turn into complete boondoggles because we're used to building them, and also cause, massive numbers of indigenous people to lose access to their land, and to do this in a very, very pseudo-democratic way. Let's just deal with let's keep our promises.
Yeah. And also just say hey, we're a wealthy nation. How about we have clean drinking water for everybody in Canada?
And how about we put, really, I don't think you need to be into identity politics to think that spending 2/3 of the amount per Indigenous child on their education is not acceptable. It's not acceptable. It's not like it's a political. It's that's not the country I want to belong to.
Yeah. Right. And the arguments against that are always just so ridiculous. I remember I was in a public debate over some of these issues, and the argument that I was getting on the other side was, well, they should just move to the big population centers, to Calgary, Edmonton, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, because that's where they can get access to services. And then being in these outlying areas, it's just too expensive to fly stuff. And the response that I had was, I said, well, we have this massive country, and if you want to maintain territorial sovereignty, you have to have people in the sparsely, you have to have people all over the place. So actually we need to have them living on Baffin Island and living in these random places in order to maintain our territorial sovereignty. But then later on, after that, my friend David Schultz, who does a lot of sort of Indigenous law, and he's been doing that for decades now, he said, John, well, actually, no, the truth is even stupider and more perverse than that. And he wrote an op-ed about this. I'll send it to you. It's really good. But he goes to these small little English communities on a small town on an island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. So here's an English community that's very isolated in a predominantly French province, and yet they have fantastic sewer system, they have a really nice school, they have exactly the kind of... So there's just this idea that even though this is an out-of-the-way place, they have standards. They have normal drinking water is clean. They have normal
it is
garbage removal.
To have any community in Canada without drinking water, right? I mean,
yeah.
Come on. We're in the 21st century.
The crazy thing is I have I have students, and I love my students, but this is one thing that bugs me is they're mainly from fairly sort of well-off suburbs of Montreal, and some of them, they mean well, and it's beautiful, and it's sweet, and the sentiment is nice, but they go to these third world things where you are building a well or doing something, and then they have a nice Facebook cover photo with the people of the village, it's but they go there for a weekend, and it's oh, we're trying to help these poor people, these poor brown people, and give them water, right? And I'm like, dude, there are places in your fucking country that don't have clean drinking water.
Yes.
Why don't you go there? Right?
Yes, for terrible reasons too. I just think this, there's also this incredibly bizarre kind of leftover paternalism about it, right? It's there's always this it's mismanaged. It's well, they're a political entity. Are we going to take away power from Toronto because it's mismanaged? We have plenty of mismanagement to go around. It's just this this odd kind of, well, I really think it's what John A. Macdonald said when he in Parliament, where he was we are the ox and they are the deer, and they're going to have to give way to the ox. I think that exact spirit, which is oddly kind of magical, they're kind of these magical beings, it's that as well as just doomed, that's really did you read the piece I wrote in the Literary Review of Canada about cultural appropriation?
Yes.
Right.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's like the thing here is that you can't define the other people within your own society without defining yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everything that I find weak and impoverishing about living in Canada, just as myself, like living in downtown Toronto, like the like living like that's
You've said some of the harshest things about
yeah,
Toronto.
I
I
do.
don't know any Montrealer that has said worse things about Toronto than you have.
No, I do take my shots at Toronto, don't I?
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting city in many ways. But like you cannot, the corruption of our relationship to Indigenous people. It goes back on ourselves. It destroys us, and we're never going to be what we could be, and we're never going to be really ourselves. We're never going to be a post-colonial entity until we find a way to acknowledge and to confront the terror of this relationship. Because mostly we just go around saying, "Oh, how great we are," right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not America. Or the other thing we do is we say we have the same problems as America. I mean, they were having anti-gun marches here. Thousands of people were showing up to them. I'm like, do you realize that you have gun laws? Like they're marching in America to get the gun laws that you have. What are you doing? Like, are you doing? Don't understand. It's like
No, I think what it is it's just Canadians are, like the rest of the world, but especially Canadians. Canadians are at the moment obsessed with American politics.
Well, we always have been.
There's,
I just find it's like,
but it's more now. I mean,
like,
polling data has shown Canadian young people are more likely to know things about the American political system. They can name the leaders of the political parties, and they won't even know anything about what's going on in Canada. At all.
See, this is like, it's like, okay, you're marching against the gun laws of your neighbors to your south, which makes you feel very smug and superior. Meanwhile, your own country has committed a cultural genocide against 600 different peoples, that some of whom still don't have access to legal drinking water, and instead you're talking about the gun laws of another country. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
We have our own disgraces that we're not going to confront because we have this colonial mentality of our own virtue.
How do we get out of that?
I don't know. You come to the point where it's like, okay, you've got a great analysis. What do we do about it? And I keep saying, I have no idea.
Okay, well, this is my sort of vision of the future. You can tell me what you think of it, but what I would like to see is something where we are less of a strong federal model, and we have more of where the large cities like Montreal and Toronto, for instance, move towards a city-state model more, where much more of where I think cities should be able to directly collect income tax, like they should, the way New York already does and other places, and they should because right now, Toronto gets constantly screwed over by Ontario. Montreal gets screwed over by Quebec all the time. We are governed by people that don't like us and don't give us the adequate amount of like resources that we need to do what we've got to do. So I would like to see, and also Indian communities, like Native communities, I would like to see them be much more autonomous as well, right? And rather than, because right now everybody is sort of Native communities and big cities in Canada are constantly going hat in hand to the federal government, to their provincial government, saying, can you please give me a handout for what I need to do? Well, the federal government, it's your money. Like they have your money. Like they have the right to your land, to your resources. Like, so I would like to sort of see more of a decentralized Canada where you have more local control of
You know,
things. I mean,
I've heard this argument before. I mean, this is what Richard Florida thinks, right? He especially thinks it in the case of America, that you're going to have to decentralize everything because the political order on top is so toxic. But I just don't you think the corruption and the evil and the alienation would just flow down to whatever level had power? I mean,
oh,
I don't know,
absolutely.
man. Like,
I don't think I'm going to solve.
Thank
yeah.
God Rob Ford didn't have any power. Like,
Yeah.
like now, I'm not sure. Here, the interesting question is, would Rob Ford had been elected if the mayor of Toronto was a powerful position? That's because, we all know here it's like a joke, right? It's like, oh, whatever.
Yeah, the weak mayor system.
Yeah, it doesn't. They don't change any. The premier really matters. Premier is like what the quality of the schools my kid is going to go to. When I get sick, how long I'm going to have to wait in line. This is determined by the people who really have power. But the question is, would people have elected Rob Ford if it were powerful? And I think the answer is Donald Trump, right? Right? It's like, yeah, they will.
Yeah,
they'll fully elect these people if for jobs that matter, because they don't really think they matter.
Yeah, no, just to clarify, I don't think, I think any political proposal, any new system that requires for it to work, that you're going to somehow change the human heart, right? That people are going to no longer be subject to greed or to corruption or anything like that. I think that's bullshit on its face. So I'm not saying that it would necessarily get rid of the problem of corruption. I just think, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb puts it in his new book, Skin in the Game, that when people have to deal with the consequences of their decisions, like, for instance, if your kids are going to the school that you're defunding, you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that, right? If you're going to defund healthcare and you have to use the same healthcare as everybody else, it doesn't guarantee a good result. It sort of makes it much more likely. And so when you have local control, for instance, it doesn't ensure that you're going to have fantastic governance or you're going to have no corruption, but it does ensure, like, for instance, if the mayor of Montreal, if Valérie, if she makes a decision that I think is bullshit, I can contact her directly. Right? She lives here. She actually doesn't live very far away from my house.
Right.
I can contact her. I can probably see her on the street when she's walking around. When you have people in Ottawa making decisions for an Indigenous community in the Northwest Territories, they are probably so out of touch with the reality up there that the chances that they're going to get it right are pretty low. Well, and more importantly, the chances that they're going to have to live with the consequences are very, very low.
Well,
right? So
no politician really ever lives with the consequences of their decisions. I mean, very rarely. I mean, I would just separate, Indigenous self-government is really a separate question to me than the structure of regional power in Canada. Because, I mean, Indigenous self-government is coming, right? That's just, we are inevitably headed that way. Because we've seen that the communities that are, that's a moral question, right? I mean, that's like the self-direction of peoples. I think that's going to be unbelievably complicated. I think it's going to be and the level where the exact point of interaction happens when you have 618 registered First Nations in Canada. Is it going to be like, well, it's self-governing except the charter? Is it going to be except you have to follow the charter? Well, Quebec doesn't follow the charter. So what about the First Nations in Quebec? Do they follow the charter? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Not saying that it shouldn't happen. It will have to happen. But it is going to be incredibly fraught, and it is I think, again, it's one of those things where it's like, let's sign up for UNDRIP. Well, okay, we've got the minister to do it. We've got a woman who was chief of the BC Nations, and her response is, oh, we can't even get rid of the Indian Act. Which is not, the Indian Act is not a document that any civilized country can have. It's not it is totally unacceptable as a legal structure for dealing with First Nations communities. But my point is like, I've always felt like the regional example is only when your side is winning in the regional level, right? Like that tends to, like, that's what it is with Richard Florida. He's like, well, the U.S. government is totally destroyed, so let's give it a try for some mayors. But if the mayors had the power, you'd probably get Donald Trump as mayors.
Okay, before I forget, I have some questions from listeners that they directly asked me to ask you.
Sure.
So you can sort of take them wherever you want. The first question is from one listener who's read your book, The Unmade Bed, and liked it very much. And one of the themes, for those of you who haven't read the book, you should go buy it right now. One of the themes is you talk about how the process of becoming a parent and having sort of a boy and a girl and having these kinds of you become much more aware of the fact that gender is this powerful thing that is not just like a social construct, and you can see like there's this boyness, going on there and this, right, and all that stuff, and so that makes you have a sort of newfound respect for how hardwired a lot of this stuff is, right? So the question was, do you think if you were to write this book as they get older, do you think it would be a different book? Because the question was essentially, I'm translating from French here, but like the question was essentially like, it's true when the kids are very young, it seems like the inborn kind of gender identity is very powerful. But the older they get, when they get to be teenagers, you realize that it's way, way more socially constructed. And so do you think it would be a different book if you wrote it sort of 10 years later?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the boyness and girlness don't go away. I think I would say that, in my experience anyway, it's more I sort of believe that genetics is everything, but gender is only a tiny part of that. Like, like it's not like, it's like, you get the kid that you get and you do the best that you can. But that doesn't mean that, but the gender part of that is actually a pretty small part of that. Like the particularity of the individual is actually what's so surprising and so both confounding and delightful, right? So it's, I mean, I do think gender, again, the idea that there is a natural component to gender seems at this moment in time to be a almost radical idea. But it's one of those radical ideas that's also so much a part of common sense that almost nobody can live without believing it. You can only really escape the idea that gender is natural for a brief moment in your 20s, really. Under strenuous forms of
Maoist re-education camps,
right? The rest
or
of
graduate school seminars.
Yeah, or I don't know about Maoist, but I would say a very, very hard push towards believing that that there are not natural distinctions here that are beyond culture. But but I would say also that there are so many more things that as I age that are more interesting than gender, that are also seem to me natural, that are in the personality of others.
Yeah, no, that's good. Second question was, it pertains to your novel, The Hunger of the Wolf, and the listener wanted to know, what was your intention with oh God, this is a spoiler alert. Oh, well, okay, I'm going to do it anyway. So what was your intention with the whole werewolf thing? Was that supposed to be sort of just kind of magical realism? Like just, hey, this is part of the story, just deal with it? Or did you mean it as some sort of deep symbolism of something else?
Well, I don't think it was anything. It's like a dreamed reality. Right. I mean, so I would prefer not to classify it as any one of those things, or it could, of course, just be the madness of the people involved. To me, it was just a kind of a shorthand for this, this kind of brutality inside these people, and also the thing about their wolfness being the best part of them. That was the sort of key thing. So, the werewolf story is really old. Like, vampires have only been around for about 200 years, but the first werewolf mentioned is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mm-hmm. There are werewolves in Ovid. There were a whole bunch of court cases about people being werewolves in France in the 13th century. Like, every culture has werewolves. Like, Iraq has werewolves. The Japanese have people who turn into foxes. So
do you have a theory about that? Because I have a pet theory about that. Do you have a theory about why that is the case?
I think it's just like, actually there is this kind of like vicious predatory, nature to human beings, and we are just animals on some level, and so it's not the switching between an animal and a man is actually not that uncommon at all.
Yeah, my theory about it is that it's similar to the centaurs, which were basically people who are seeing humans on horseback, and right. They've never seen humans on horseback, and so they imagine that this is somehow some sort of organism, right? Like one thing, right? I think we formed a partnership. They keep pushing it back. I mean, it used to be 50,000 years. Now some people are saying as much as 100,000 years ago that we formed a partnership with dogs, which were wolves originally. And my theory is that when people who did not have this incredibly intimate, tight, symbiotic relationship with these wolves, basically, met people who were wolf people, mm-hmm. I think they imagined that they were somehow one thing, right?
Yeah,
getting attacked by.
I like that theory.
I'm glad that you said that, because when the person asked me this question, my initial response was, sort of Pablo Neruda, poetry explained as banal. Like, I'm not going to ask him that question. But I didn't think it was symbolic in a heavy-handed way at all, actually.
No, I mean, it's not like you could cut out the werewolf part and you would just be the history of a family. But the werewolf part is really the history of a family with a secret. I was really trying to understand the intense.
But that's what gives it its dream quality.
Yeah, but also it explains the intense privacy of these people.
Yes.
Like, what do they have to hide? What are they hiding?
Okay, the last question. This is a total curveball. I don't even know where you're going to go with this. But what do you think of this whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon? Like, where he's just this, like, rock star status, right? Like, selling huge amounts of books, What do you think is going on with him?
I mean, I think I think it's like simple answers to complex problems. This seems to be what drives everything popular, right? I mean, it's the same thing as like Jessica Valenti or Tomi Lahren. It's like there's just and I mean, I will say that his answers are like criminally simple, right? I mean, he seems to want to be taken as an intellectual, of the highest order, but like actually there are not 12 rules for life, right? Like life is not the kind of thing that actually aligns itself to rules. But to me, it's sort of like I certainly don't feel envy or malice towards him at all. I think it's just part of.
A lot of the reviews of his stuff are just dripping with, how dare people, read this guy's books when you should be reading mine.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like. Well, I hope this isn't too contemptuous, but it's a bit like Rupi Kaur's poetry,
I'm not familiar.
The Facebook poet who sold more than 10 times Homer's poetry last year. And, and she's a Canadian poet. And a lot of people, there's a typical poem would be like, well, there's not really. She's an Instagram poet, so she has 2.5 million Instagram followers, and she's massively successful. And
so telling that I've never even heard of this.
Well,
person.
here's a poem of hers. Representation is vital. Otherwise, the butterfly, surrounded by a group of moths, unable to see itself, will keep trying to become the moth. Right? Like, so this is like, well, look, I mean, we're dealing with.
Fucking serious?
Yeah, you've never heard of her? No.
No.
Yeah, she's easily the most famous poet in the world right now.
Oh,
but essentially, it's like literature for the post-literate. It's literature without complexity, and without like when you actually go into these Jordan Peterson essays, like there's not a lot there. They feel like essays. They feel like advice. They feel like philosophy. But there isn't actually a lot there. Just as when you go into a Rupi Kaur poem, there isn't a lot there. But I don't judge Rupi Kaur either, like, or her fans. Like, if this is meaning something to them, and this is somehow making them feel connected to ideas, then I guess it's good. But it's the opposite of what I do. It's the opposite of what I want to see in the world. And like it's to me, like, the point of reading and writing is that you learn that almost every question in life, the answer is it depends, right? Like, circumstances are varying. Like, I know that's an inherently unsatisfying answer, but like, circumstances vary.
I think it's profoundly humanizing, and it's if you can embrace doubt,
exactly,
that actually it makes you much sort of kinder to yourself and others.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what I want. Our times are going away from that as rapidly as possible. And I mean, like, the one thing about Peterson is that he's really been lucky in his choice of enemies. I mean, like, when you have people showing up with garrots to your talks.
Oh my God.
And, the BBC interview, it was just like, wow, you really haven't put any thought into this at all. Like, and he handily wins these things, but ultimately it's the same. The popularity is in the same metric as a Facebook post, and like, the other thing is, these people have kind of always existed, right? The people who sell simple answers to complex problems, and or poetry that is like poetry without any work, right? Poetry without any having to read the words to think through what they mean. And there certainly were tons of that in the 70s. My God, like, so I think it's actually just part of intellectual life.
Yeah, I think actually there's something else going on with Jordan Peterson. I can't really put my finger on it exactly, but I disagree with you. I don't think it's that he's offering exactly sort of simple solutions. I think in fact, a lot of his appeal is, I think, that it's kind of cloudy, it's murky, it's not very clear. It's kind of, it has the appeal of mysticism, and that most of the people that I've talked to who are big fans, a lot of my students are crazy about Jordan Peterson, and when I ask them, well, what do you think he believes? They have wildly divergent. It's almost like a Rorschach test. Like, you can sort of project all sorts of fears and desires and thoughts onto what he's saying, and because he very often is not very clear, right? Then it makes it possible for you to sort of have whatever Peterson you want in many ways. I mean, it's so.
But it's not very clear. But on the other hand, it's 12 rules for life, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you remember there was that amazing, it's definitely when Stephen Colbert like won my heart, when he had Roy Moore. This is when he was, back in the day when he was all over the press in the States because he had the 10 Commandments placed on the front. You remember that? He had the 10 Commandments placed on the front lawn. And so Colbert was interviewing him, and Colbert is, of course, a devout Catholic, right? And so he asked Roy Moore, can you name the 10 Commandments?
Right.
He couldn't do it. And then he interviewed all these other Republican lawmakers who were in favor of what was happening, and they couldn't name the 10 Commandments. Well, you know what? I've done exactly the same thing with those 12 rules.
Right.
Ask like somebody who's a devout
Jordan Peterson what they are.
Disciple of Jordan Peterson. Say, can you tell me what the 12 rules are? They can't.
Well, there you go, right? I mean, I can't think of a more damning. That's an indictment of a writer that's more brutal than anything I said. I mean, like honestly, it's like, I mean, this is the kind of way that everything tends, right? Like, there's a lot of people who really love David Foster Wallace who could not tell you anything about his writing at all, except maybe that there were footnotes in some of the essays, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I think, he definitely has that thing. You're right, where you can impose your own vision on it. Like, he's a bit like Charles Bukowski. I can see why students would like it, right? Where it's like this is grand and important and life-changing and world-changing, but it's also undemanding. And it's also something that requires you to just, because despite his, like, you've got to be disciplined, you've got to make your bed all the time, like, we all know, we grown-ups, that, like, there are lots of people out there who make their bed every morning and are fucking miserable, right? Like, and are really, really unhappy. Because, like, actually life involves a lot of luck. It involves a lot of, like, things that are out of people's control. It involves a lot of, like, it's much more.
But I think that's very much, if I can sort of psychologize you, Stephen, that's very much. I mean, one thing that comes through to me in your essays, in your novels, in your writing, is that you have just, I think, dispositionally, I think you have an incredibly high tolerance for chaos, right? And so your whole thing about your whole thing about how, like, we should just let our house be messy. To me, what I see there is that you are just somebody who has a very high tolerance for disorder, doubt, chaos, right? But not everybody does.
Well, very few.
Right?
Do.
I mean, and I think actually his advice for a lot of people is fantastic advice. I mean, you look at Max Weber, the great German sociologist. He was in a horrible depression for a long time, and he got himself out of it, and he wrote about this. And the way that he got himself out of it was basically he put himself on a kind of Jordan Peterson 12 rules for life type program. He put himself on a very strict schedule where he got up at exactly the same time every day. He went to bed at the same time. He ate at the same times. He had regular exercise. He kept his place really, really clean. And this is what got him out of a crippling depression that almost, destroyed.
Well, look, I mean,
his life.
I'm not arguing against discipline. Like, and I certainly have measures of discipline. I had the same thing reading, when I researched the red pill, right? Where the red pill was totally despised by everyone, and it was considered this repository of horror. But then when you actually go and look at it, it's mostly like 19-year-old guys trying to stop masturbating all the time, and trying to stop playing video games all the time, and actually, like, go to school and make something of themselves so that, women will be impressed by them. Like, that's like 85% of the posts, right? For some reason, they can only cloak that discipline in a vision of the world. First of all, there's this vision of the world as, like, brutal and monstrous, and we all have to, like, and traditional values are under threat, which I don't really understand, because I don't observe that in the world. Like, of course, there's a seed of good in Jordan Peterson, of course. But, like, you have to ask yourself, like, it's sort of like when Nietzsche said, like, don't say that you think it's good for people to believe in God. Say that you believe in the police, right? Like, right? Like, he has all these, like, yes, of course, discipline is good, of course, but that, any self-help book is going to tell you that. right? That's
But they're not going to say it in a way that sounds really grand and awesome.
yeah, that's right.
You know, it's sort of like the Masons, right? Like
Yeah.
the Masons basically at their core, they were pushing for some pretty sort of vanilla Enlightenment values, which by the way, I think are, pretty awesome. But they wrapped it in mysticism.
I think when you say like I have this tolerance for chaos, like
You really, really
I don't
do.
think I think what I do is I have real low tolerance for grandeur. Like I met a lot. Like I really do.
How
think,
Canadian of you?
Well, I do think when you meet people, particularly people in power, the people who really scare me when I meet them who are in power are people who think it's all a big adventure, and it's all gonna and it's all gonna like those are the people who started the Iraq War. They thought it was going to be a big adventure. And it was going to be grand, and they were going to liberate the world, and they were going to spread. Like, I fear those people much more than I fear lowly bureaucrats. I do,
Well, it
Maybe I have a
depends if they've
tolerance
got
for
an
chaos.
insecure. No, I think you do. I think it's just one of the biggest. I mean, you see this in marriage. I see this with my wife. I'm sure you see the same thing. One of the biggest mistakes I think we all do, and it's so hard to not do this, is that we imagine that other people are basically, more or less like us, right? And that's our. And so we think that, right? And so I think if you have a real kind of rage for order, or if you have a very high tolerance for chaos, you sort of imagine that other people are like that too, and they really aren't.
But
I mean, that's it. For me. Like my 40s has been one of the biggest revelations that I just keep happening again and again in my 40s so far is just the realization of radical difference.
yes,
And rather than just always assuming that everybody is sort of very much, in this Walt Whitman type sort of omnivorous way, like everybody's like me, is to realize like, no, they're fucking not. Like they've got their own stuff going on, and like I have to like listen to what they're saying and try and imagine, rather than just sort of projecting all the time.
but see, and I think it's actually one thing that happened to me after Trump, or maybe it was my 40s, was like realizing that observation was its own art, and that it was not something that you just did. It was not something that just happened to you, that you saw something. Like you had to consciously make an attempt to observe something, and that was in fact a work. That was a bit of work. And when you start to constantly try and look at things, I think that's what we're talking about in the essay, like why Montaigne is constantly surprised, is because he's trying to see through his own seeing all the time, right? Now, compare that, you remember the line that Peterson is causing so much scandal is, or one of them, is like, men are order and women are chaos, right? Because he's got this he's got this thing that he's inherited from Jung, which incidentally is not at all men are order, women are chaos. But anyway, simple maybe that's what life is like in his house. But, if you go out into the world and write a book, say, about gender, and go and talk to women, go and talk to men, go into their houses, look at them, you will not find women are chaos, men are order. Like, go try telling that to them. Yeah. Like, it's really, usually men are spreading chaos. Women are picking up the pieces and trying to build some semblance of a decent life in the aftermath of the total chaos of men. Right?
Yeah, and who's encouraging the kids to climb higher in the tree and to, paint on the walls? It's usually not
This is why it seems to me like observation, like the simple act of observation is actually the most radical aesthetic and political act right now. Because it's so, like, you're right, people want order. They want men are order, women are chaos. But it's like, when you say like, okay, well, let's go look. Let's go see. Then you realize, then you get into this, like, it depends, right? And that's that's for lack of a better word, the truth. It depends.
Yeah. Well, this is, Nietzsche's critique of Platonism and Christianity and he said, that it's just obsessed with depths and
Right.
obsessed with idealization. And what they need to do is actually just observe. And there's that wonderful line. It's in I think it's in the prologue or the preface to the Joyful Wisdom, where
It takes
he
courage
says,
to
like,
live on the surface of things.
yeah, exactly. Where he says, like, oh, those Greeks, they were profound. They were superficial out of profundity. They knew how to fall in love with the texture of things, the colors, the shapes, and to actually sort of fall in love with the surface of things, right?
Well, that's
And
why I want to write about celebrity, right? Because it is the ultimate. It is the ultimate surface of thing that no one can stand to look at. No one can stand to look at it because it's so superficial. But actually, when you look at it, it's like, oh, this is the world, right?
Yeah.
Right, like,
and something like the perfection of Megan Fox's sort of symmetry, her face, that is the content of the form, right? That is the
well, and she had enough self-consciousness to acknowledge it. I mean, that's why I felt I had to write about it. I mean, if she'd just been like, oh, I'm not really that pretty, like, she knew, like, I have the perfect face, and that is just a roll of the dice, right? That is just like pure luck. That just like LeBron James could be an athlete in any sport, right? Just because these physical gifts are just so extraordinary, right? Like, it's the same with her face, right? It is just an extreme physical gift, and she was so aware of it. Oh, it's really too bad people misunderstood that piece.
Oh, it was fantastic, but. Anyway, we should probably end there because
since we've been talking for like 2.5 hours.
I'm like stealing your entire day. I could talk to you for another 3 hours, but
it's really fun.
We will definitely have to do this again. And,
for sure.
I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah,
and
you too.
I'm looking forward to I have the hardcover already, but I'm looking forward to the paperback version of the Unmade Bed arriving from Amazon.
Give my love to your students.
I shall.
Tell them not to read Jordan Peterson too much. They can read him once, but only to reject him.
All right. Have a good day. Bye.
Ciao.